Today we're going to be replacing the stabilizer links, inner and outer tie rods, and the upper control arm to refresh the suspension on your car. I've got a whole bunch of parts from Mevotech for this vehicle, including the boot bellows, the stabilizer links, the inner and outer tie rods, as well as the upper control arms. In order to properly check the suspension, we need to jack up the control arm to relieve the tension from the spring. Then I'm going to slide in the bar and push up on the wheel, and you can see that there's no play on the lower ball joint. Taking a look in the upper control arm, you can see that there is play in the upper ball joint over here. Now wiggling the wheel side to side, I can feel that the tie rods are also loose. Like most Hondas, the left stabilizer link is also broken. So with the wheel off, we can have a closer look at this double wishbone front suspension. We've got an upper control arm over here with an ABS line tied to it. We've got the steering knuckle over here. Over here we have the outer tie rod, followed by the inner tie rod, and that steers the knuckle. We've got the suspension fork that leads up to the coilover suspension. Down inside of here we have the stabilizer link that attaches the sway bar to the lower control arm. For the upper control arm, we have a castle nut that ties the ball joint to the knuckle here, and we have two 14mm bolts that go into the body at the top here around this strut, and we've also got a small 10mm nut that holds this line on. So I'm just going to soak these down with some PB blaster so we can loosen them up. I'm going to first remove this cotter pin, then I'm going to loosen up the 17mm castle nut. Now we need to unseat the taper of the ball joint, so I'm just going to give this a hit with a hammer. So to prevent this ball stud from rotating, I'm just going to clamp it with a vice grip here, and then remove it with my ratchet. And I'm going to remove this 10mm nut here for the ABS bracket. Oh, it just snapped off. I've got the knuckle tied down here so it doesn't stretch the ABS sensor. Now in order to get enough clearance in here to get my wrench, I need to drop this coilover down. So we're going to have to go up at the top and release it from the strut mount. Up at the top of the strut mount there's two 12mm and three 14mm bolts that I need to remove. I'm just going to pry down on the lower control arm here to bring the strut down. Oops. So you can see with the strut out of the way, I can get my 14mm wrench on there, and then I can loosen up this bolt. So I've got my 14mm wrench on this side over here of the strut. I'm going to break this bolt free here. You might also be able to reach that bolt in here with an extension and a wobbly socket. Here's the bolt. Here's the other bolt. Now I can remove the upper control arm. And the blue box here is Mevotech's Supreme line, and it's supposed to have upgraded bushings and an enhanced design from OE. So let's have a closer look. So here we have the old OEM arm compared to the new Mevotech Supreme arm. The first thing you'll notice right away is how worn out this OEM arm is. The ball joint is super loose, and the bushings here are also pretty worn out. Over here, if we compare that to the Mevotech Supreme arm, first thing I pick it up, it feels much heavier than this OEM arm over here. We've got enhanced bushings over here where it's much stiffer than the OEM. Underneath this boot protector here that protects the boot, we have the ball joint, and this moves really nice and smoothly, and there's no play at all. Inside of here there are metal sintered bearings, and it also comes with hardware which has a grease fitting because this is a greasable design so you can service it. And it also has a nylock nut over here instead of the old castle nuts that tend to rust up. Other than that, if we lay the part on top of each other, you can see it's the exact same size and dimensions as OE. And we've also got the mount point here that I broke off for the ABS sensor. I'm just going to thread this grease fitting onto the back plate here. Also good to make sure this faces the outside of the vehicle so you can easily access it with a grease gun when you need to service the sintered bearing ball joint. Now before we install the control arm, it's essential that we clean all the mounting points on the knuckle. So I'm just going to come in here with my brother's toothbrush and clean up that mating surface over there and inside here, and then I'll just wipe that down with my brother's old t-shirt. And we're going to install the new Mevotech control arm into the chassis here, and then I'm going to insert the bolt into the control arm bushing, and then I'm just going to use my ratcheting wrench to snug down these bolts and snug down the bolt on this side. Now an important thing to note is bushing preload on these control arms. You want to snug these down in a position where the control arm is going to normally be when the vehicle is resting on its own weight. So that'll be somewhere up here instead of down at the bottom here. And we'll just snug these down. Now it is difficult to get a torque wrench in here, but you want to make sure you hand tighten these because the torque spec on these are not that high. Now I can reposition the strut and tighten the nuts back up at the top. And we'll just line up that ball joint over there, and then I'll put on the hardware. And then we'll just tighten up this nut. It's now 15mm. Now the torque spec on this one is not very high. So once again, you want to use your discretion and use hand tools only. Alright, and the last piece over here is to reinstall this little nut that holds the ABS wire on. but mine broke, so I'm gonna have to find another one. Now periodically you would want to grease this ball joint to flush out all the contaminants because it is a sintered bearing design. You can see the boot here has a little relief to allow that grease to pump through. So here we have the stabilizer link. As you can see, it's broken and it's supposed to be attached to this ball stud over here on the sway bar and down at the control arm. But typically the nuts here are corroded and I won't be able to get those off, so I'm just gonna have to cut this link off. And there we have the old link cut off. And there's the nut. So the stabilizer links I'm using are from Mevotech. It's from their Supreme line. So we're going to open up the box and see what's inside. So here we have what is left of the OEM link. You can see this here has a plastic bearing on the inside where this ball would rotate around inside of there. And the ultimate cause of failure is the plastic got brittle and snapped off. You can see this here is the replacement stabilizer link. It's a lot more beefier and chunkier. And inside of here there are metal sintered bearings, so there won't be any snapping plastics like you see there. And it will last a really long time. It also comes with these grease fittings here so that you can actually grease this part periodically to let any contaminants get flushed out. So the new stabilizer links come with locking hardware. Instead of an internal hex like the OE design that tends to strip out, it also has wrench flats on the ball studded here, so you can put your wrench here and tighten up that nut. So I'm just going to be threading on the Zerk fittings over here. So with a little bit of wiggling, I'm going to install the new part onto the sway bar. And I'll just slightly lift up that sway bar and slide this in. Now I'm going to install the hardware onto the back ball stud over here, and then install this nut on this ball stud down over here. So to tighten this down, I'm just going to slide a 14mm wrench over the wrench flat and then 15mm on the nut, and then just crank that down. And you're going to want to hand tighten this because the torque spec on these are not that high, and it's a little bit difficult to get a torque wrench inside of here. You want to make sure that the grease fittings are oriented in a way that you can get at it with a grease gun for service down the road. So here we have the outer tie rod followed by the inner tie rod here and the steering rack boot. You can see this whole entire area is full of oil due to a power steering leak up at the top there and potentially a leaking steering rack. This whole thing feels really loose and I can hear the clunking when I move it. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the steering rack boot from the rack. There's usually a little band here that I need to release with a screwdriver, and that'll pop right off. Next I'm going to remove this 17mm nut that holds the tie rod onto the steering knuckle. And then I'm just going to pull back the boot here off of the steering rack. Watch all that steering fluid drip out. So I'm just going to pull the boot back over here. Now this here is the inner tie rod housing where it joins to the steering rack. We have this washer here that's staked over the wrench flats. So I'm just going to use a chisel here and flatten those out. Alright, I've got the adjustable wrench on there. I'm going to crack this free. That was a lot easier than I thought. Next up I need to free the taper from the outer tie rod to the knuckle. So I'm just going to give it a couple of whacks with a hammer. And there's the outer tie rod free from the knuckle. And then now I can unscrew the outer tie rod housing from the steering rack assembly. Just use some vice grips there to grip this on. And just remove that assembly from the vehicle. So the replacement tie rod ends that I'm using are from Mevotech. We've got the boot over here. We've got a new inner tie rod over here. And we've got the original grade, which is the equivalent to OE tie rod over here. So let's have a closer look at what's inside. So here we have the old OE tie rod compared to the new tie rod. Now this tie rod here has a little bit of play in this inner tie rod part here and is really loose, and so is the outer. It's pretty loose. We've got the inner tie rod boot here, and that comes with these two ties here to clamp it down. We've also got the inner tie rod itself, and that comes with a nice little grease package to put inside of the ball socket there. It comes with its own hardware here, which is a jam nut, and it also comes with the steering rack spacer, which is what we had to pound out over here. Finally, we have the outer tie rod. Now it comes with a nylocking nut over here, and it also has this boot protector, and it also comes with its own jam nut, so that's a really good bonus. So here we've got the inner tie rod. You can see it's got like a metal bearing inside of there with some grease screws, and it moves nice and smoothly. We've got the outer tie rod over here, and this uses a plastic design which is equivalent to OE because this is Mevotech's original grade design, and it moves nice and smooth. Now these two are going to thread onto each other, but we're first going to screw this one onto the car. And before I install the tie rod, I'm just going to put this grease that came with it inside of this ball socket over here. So next I'm just going to use my wife's toothbrush here and distribute this grease around because you're not supposed to touch it. So just before we install the inner tie rod, I'm just going to clean up this area with some brake cleaner, and it's coming with my brother's sock here, and clean up this rack. So I'm going to first install the new spacer washer onto where the inner tie rod mounts to the rack, and then I'm going to install the inner tie rod. Just thread that on. Then I'm going to slide my inner tie rod tool onto there. There's different sizes that come with this kit, and then I'll slide this extension piece onto the ears and lock it in. And then I can use any 1/2-inch drive tool to drive this inner tie rod nice and snug. Then unlock the tool and remove it. Next I'm going to slide on the inner tie rod boot over the inner tie rod. Now I'm going to apply some anti-seize to these threads here so the jam nuts don't seize up next time I need to do an alignment. And then thread on the jam nut. And then I'm going to thread on the outer tie rod. Now the reason why I didn't separate the inner from the outer tie rods is so I can keep my toe measurement. So I'm just going to take a quick measurement to the center of that tie rod there. And it comes up to exactly 30 centimeters. So I'm going to transfer that over to the new tie rod. So I'm just going to pull the boot back here to get to the edge of the inner tie rod. And take my measurements. And it looks like I might have to do a little bit of adjustment. So I'll just put my 14mm wrench onto the flats here and tighten down this tie rod to adjust the length. So now with the adjustments made, I'm directly into spec with the toe. I'm just going to use a little bit of brake cleaner here to clean up the surface where the new tie rod is going to mount and the taper. So next I'm going to put this little boot clamp over here around the inner tie rod and zip it up. Then I'm going to put the large supplied zip tie around the tie rod here and zip it up. And you can see we've got the zip tie on the back and on the front holding the boot on. Next I'm going to plug the outer tie rod into the steering knuckle, and then I'm going to thread on the nylock nut on the bottom here. I'm just going to tighten down this 17mm nut, and I'm going to snug this down because the torque spec on this is not that high. And then I'm just going to tighten up this jam nut over here nice and snug to hold the alignment in place. So with everything torqued down, I'm going to replace the wheel. With the car back on its own weight, we're going to snug up the strut bolts. Now that's pretty much how to refresh the suspension system on your Acura or Honda. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.